So apologies to those of you who are joining us online that we're running a little bit late, but a very warm welcome to this session that has been put together by the European Academy's Science Advisory Council, ESAC. The title is Climate Justice, Seeking Equitable Solutions to Adverse Effects of Climate Change on Health. So our focus will be on health. The context for our session is the theme of the World Science Forum, Science for Social Justice. And also relevant in our context is the recent COP27 meeting that was held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, where one of the key outcomes was an agreement that there would be put in place a funding mechanism for loss and damage. It was finally acknowledged by the richer nations that the loss and damage that's been created by climate change needed to be compensated at a multilateral level. A lot still needs to be done, but here is an example of social justice. We're linking climate change and social justice, focusing on health, and highlighting the unequal burden that is borne by different groups. The solutions to the climate crisis must be seen through the lens of social justice. So as we work towards these solutions, let's not forget the very important theme of social justice. So I'd now like to call up my panelists, and first I'd like to call up Christina Moberg, who is going to give us an overview. She is the president of ESAC. Our second panelist is not with us here, but he is going to make an online presentation which has been pre-recorded, and that is Professor Sir Andy Haynes. He is from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, so can we give him a round of applause as well? Our third speaker is Professor Robin Fears, who is the ESAC Biosciences Program Director. Our next speaker is Shabana Khan, she's the director of the Indian Research Academy. Welcome, Shabana. And our final panelist is Professor Corradi Wright, who is the Chief Specialist Scientist at the Medical Research Council here in South Africa, who unfortunately was not able to be with us today, but we will try to do the best with her presentation. So without further ado, let me ask for Christine to make her presentation on the part of ESAC. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I also would like to welcome you all to this session. But before we move to the presentation of the reports on the effects of climate change on our health, I would like to present ESAC. So ESAC stands for European Academy Science Advisory Council, and ESAC is an independent voice of science in Europe, and it's independent from political, financial, and industrial interests. And the members of ESAC are the national science academies in the EU member states, plus Norway, Switzerland, and the UK. And the focus of ESAC is to mobilize the best minds, because we have the science academies, so we have access to the best, many of the best minds in Europe, in order to give science-based advice to policymakers. And I would also like to mention that we have good links with other organizations in Europe, in particular the Science Advice Mechanism with SAPEA, but also to other organizations like ALEA, All European Academies, and FEAM, which stands for Federation of European Academies of Medicine. So what we do in ESAC is to provide science for policy. We do not work with policy for science. And we do not perform our own research, but we do analysis of what is written on different topics in the scientific literature, and provide the analysis to the policymakers as well as recommendations. They are intended for a policy-oriented audience, and particularly in the European Union institutions in Brussels, but also to the policymakers in the member state, and to some extent also to the general public. And what is important is that the advice we provide is timely. So independent, reliable, and relevant are key issues for ESAC. So we work in 3 core programs, and they are biosciences, which include health aspects, and we also work with energy and also with environment. And these are just, as you can see here, some examples of recent reports. One is from the biosciences group, the decarbonization of the health sector. The other one is regulation of genome-edited plants in the European Union, because this is a major problem with the restrictions to genome editing plants in the European Union. From the energy panel, a recent one concerns decarbonizations of buildings for climate, health, and jobs, and another one, hydrogen and synthetic fuels. And from the environment panel, finally, regenerative agriculture in Europe, because the sustainable agriculture is, as is certainly all known, instrumental for the climate. And forest bioenergy update, bioenergy connected to carbon capture and storage, and its role in integrated assessment models. And we have been working very much on the use of bioenergy for electricity production, for example. So I can advise you to look, if you are interested in some of these topics, to look at our website or the Inter-Academy Partnership website, and you will have access to all reports. This is just to show that some of our results are quite often also published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature. So I mentioned Inter-Academy Partnership. We are actually the European regional network of the Inter-Academy Partnership. And this means that we work together with the other regional networks in the Americas, in Asia, and not least what's important during this World Science Forum, also in Africa. And the reports that will be presented here started with a report from the European network in 2019. This was followed by a workshop in Cyprus that was also, the proceedings were published, and then reports from the different regional networks, and that this year ended up with a global report on health issues. So by these words, I will hand over again to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Marburg. So we'll now go to the pre-recorded presentation by Professor Andrew Haynes. And if there's anyone joining us online, I believe you're welcome to post questions in the chat, and they will be brought to me to read out to our panelists. Thank you.
Well, it's a great honor and a privilege for me to give an introduction to the work of the Inter-Academy Partnership Climate Change and Health Project. And I'm going to give a brief overview of the impacts of climate change on human health, and then say something about the actions that can be taken to adapt to climate change that we can't prevent, and to mitigate climate change, to reduce the risks of dangerous climate change by cutting greenhouse gas emissions. So the IEP project started in 2019, led by the German National Academy of Sciences in Leopoldina, funded by BMBF. And the first report was the regional report for Europe, published in 2019, and this helped in scoping the project. And then since then, we've had 3 regional reports for Africa, Asia, and the Americas, which provide regional perspectives and recommendations for each region. And then the Global Synthesis report, highlighting the regional similarities and differences and providing some recommendations and advice for decision makers for implementation at different levels, global, regional, and national, taking into account, of course, local contexts and local needs and circumstances. So this infographic is a summary of what is quite a complex picture, and it shows you how the increased levels of carbon dioxide and short-lived climate pollutants like methane and black carbon and others are causing rising temperatures, which have now reached, of course, about 1.2 degrees centigrade global average above pre-industrial, causing rising sea levels and increasing extreme weather events. Through a range of demographic, socioeconomic, and other environmental factors, these can modify and influence the magnitude and pattern of risks from climate change. And you can see that some of them they're summarized in the middle of this infographic. And then through a range of different exposure pathways, these different pathways affect a range of different health outcomes at the bottom of the infographic. So these range from the most direct, extreme heat, for example, or extreme weather events like floods and droughts and extreme storms, air quality, for example, through increasing intensity and frequency of wildfires, or changes in air pollution like tropospheric ozone, for example, water quality and quantity, which of course can affect human health through a range of different pathways, food supply and safety, which can increase the risks of undernutrition, vector-borne disease distribution and ecology, and then on the right side, the most indirect, but perhaps in the end turn out to be amongst the most important pathways, those mediated through social factors, increasing poverty, population displacement, and poverty conflict as well. So you can see that climate change can affect a whole range of different health outcomes from this slide. And just to give you a couple of very brief examples, one, of course, is the effect of extreme heat on labor productivity. So as the temperatures increase, it becomes progressively more difficult to undertake vigorous physical activity. And that will have very major impacts on the capacity of those who work outdoors or in unair-conditioned environments to undertake physical labor as the climate is increasingly heating up. And of course, that's already having an impact now. But by the time we reach over 2, perhaps 2.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels, which could occur later this century, obviously depending on the decisions being made, about 1 billion people will be exposed to such extreme heat that they won't be able to undertake even moderate physical labor safely in the hottest month of the year, and probably more than that. So that will affect the livelihoods of subsistence farmers, for example, and many others who work without air conditioning and where there are limited opportunities for adaptation. And on the slide, you can see how that yellow area expands as the temperature increase goes up, that encompassing really quite a lot of sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, and parts of Latin America as well. So what about the effects of climate change on health, and distinguishing that from the effects of extreme heat, which might occur through natural fluctuations in the temperature? Well, emerging evidence shows us that climate change is having an effect on health now. And this is a paper published last year in Nature Climate Change by my colleagues Ana Vicedo Cabrera, Antonio Gasparini, and a large group of collaborative researchers using data from over 730 sites in 43 countries. And they showed that more than a third of the total heat deaths over recent decades could be attributed to human-induced climate change. So, in other words, they weren't due to natural variability, natural fluctuations. They could be attributed to the greenhouse gas emissions from human activity. But you can also see from the map that there are important gaps in our evidence. And one of those gaps, of course, is in sub-Saharan Africa, apart from South Africa, where we do have some data. So you can see that many parts of the world where we'd most like to know what's happening, we have the least evidence. And so these estimates may well be serious underestimates, and these gaps need to be filled in as a matter of urgency. When we look at vector-borne diseases, we can also see that future risks of mosquito-borne diseases will increase in a hotter world. A paper published again last year by Colin Gonzalez and others in Lancet Planetary Health showed that if temperatures increase to over 3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, possibly 4.7 billion, up to 4.7 billion people could be at risk from these common vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue, compared with 2.4 billion people if we were able to keep temperature increases down to 1 degree, which of course is extremely improbable at this stage. And so there's big differences between a future with relatively unabated heating and that with controlled heating. And even taking into account population increases, you can see very big differences in the number of people exposed to risks of these common vector-borne diseases. We also know that there's a range of impacts on food production, and the image here shows you where there's likely to be reductions in yields, crop yields, between the present and 2050. You can see that for much of Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and so on, there's going to be declines, and that these are likely to get increasingly severe as the temperatures increase further in the latter part of this century, middle to the latter part of the century in particular. There may be increases in some temperate regions, but we don't know whether populations will be able to afford to buy food on an increasingly competitive market. And as we've seen from the Ukraine war, there of course can be other factors which prevent grain being exported, or at least reduce the ability to export grain from these regions to those areas where decreases in crop yield are expected. Now, it's important to recognize that it's not just the yields of crops that decrease, it's also the nutrient quality. So as you increase the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, you actually reduce the levels of iron, zinc, and other micronutrients. And about 2 billion people already suffer from micronutrient deficiency. So those deficiencies like to be increased as a result of climate change. And again, it's not just staple crops, it's also fruit and vegetables, which we know are very important for human health, particularly for the prevention of non-communicable diseases. But in addition to all these impacts on physical health, we're also increasingly recognizing that there are many mental health effects of climate change. Increases in common mental disorders after wildfires, droughts, and floods, for example. This concept of solastalgia, or the distress caused by environmental change, which has been seen in communities ranging from the Arctic, where populations have been displaced from their communities because of melting ice, to Australian farmers whose livelihoods have been lost as a result of drought. And of course, many young people are suffering from climate anxiety, very understandably. Faced with a hazardous and uncertain future, there's increasing levels of anxiety. So the mental health toll, the damage caused by climate change, both anticipated and current and projected, is really increasingly becoming apparent. So what can we do to address the health challenges of climate change? Well, there are two different responses, aren't there? They're mutually, of course, they need to be integrated as far as possible. Adaptation, action to manage the risks of climate change impacts through better disaster management and business continuity, more resilient healthcare systems that are capable of dealing with infectious disease outbreaks or extreme heat exposure, for example. Flood protection, the importance of green space, which can both help to cool cities, but also can be beneficial for physical and mental health, and reduce the need for energy-hungry air conditioning, for example. And then mitigation, of course, moving towards a clean net zero greenhouse gas emission economy as soon as possible. And this will bring with it many accompanying benefits in the near term, in addition to the benefits of reducing the risks of dangerous climate change. So these near-term benefits include those from reduced air pollution, because as we burn fossil fuels, we don't just create greenhouse gases, of course, we also create fine particles, PM2.5, which of course on a global scale are a major killer, accounting for millions of premature deaths worldwide. Food systems are responsible for about 25% of greenhouse gas emissions, and a disproportionate amount come from livestock, for example, from methane from livestock, but also from other sources like rice paddies, for example. So changing diets, offering people a healthy, lower environmental impact diets can be beneficial for climate and beneficial for human health. And then finally, other systems like transport systems, making available more active travel, more public transport and so on, can reduce emissions and improve health. So this summarizes what cities could do to adapt and mitigate climate change. I've mentioned clean, low-carbon energy, green spaces, good for mental and physical health, housing improvements like water and sanitation, important for adapting to the effects of climate change, and accessible and efficient public transport and active travel like walking and cycling, which bring the dual benefits of increased physical activity and reduced air pollution, particularly if we can reduce injury risk as well by separating walkers and cyclists from motorized vehicles. This slide just summarizes some of the benefits from reduced air pollution from a paper a few years ago led by Jos Lelyveld and colleagues in Mainz. And you can see that on a global scale, the estimates were about 3.6 million premature deaths could be averted at 2015 population estimates if we could rapidly phase out fossil fuels. And you can see where these deaths could be particularly prevented on the map. India, China, much of Europe, North America. Less so in sub-Saharan Africa and parts of Latin America because there are less fossil fuels burnt at present. But of course, if sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America go down a more fossil fuel intensive development pathway, then there would be increasing deaths from fossil fuel related air pollution as well. So if we look at the benefits overall from these policies, this is a paper last year in Lancet Planetary Health, which studied 9 countries and looked at what would happen if the nationally determined contributions, which are the commitments that countries make under the Paris Agreement, put health at the center of the climate agenda, and showed that in these 9 countries alone, ranging from South Africa, Indonesia, Nigeria, but also including UK, Germany, USA, China, Brazil, you can see that there could be millions of premature deaths prevented from the health co-benefits of these policies. So over 1.5 million from air pollution, over 6 million from diet, and over 2 million from more physical activity, and that's just in these 9 countries alone. So really quite substantial benefits. You can't just add them together because there is some overlap between the health outcomes affected, but nevertheless gives you an idea of the potential magnitude of the co-benefits. We're also increasingly recognizing that the healthcare system itself is an important source of greenhouse gas emissions, probably between 4 and 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And on the left, you can see for the National Health Service in England where these emissions come from. And you can see that many of them are scope 3 or indirect emissions from the emissions embedded in medicines, in medical devices, business services, and so on. So these are in addition to the energy actually used in health facilities. So we need to address all these 3 scopes of emissions in order to reduce the environmental footprint of the healthcare system. And healthcare systems, of course, need to be resilient to climate change, as well as having a lower environmental footprint. At COP26, over 50 countries committed to building health systems which are able to withstand the impacts of climate change and which are low carbon and sustainable, and 14 set a deadline of 2050 or earlier by which they will reach net zero emissions. Since then, additional countries have joined up. So in conclusion then, there are major benefits to be had from adapting to and mitigating climate change, benefits to human health. We have to do both. We have to integrate these two. In the absence of effective action, there are major threats to health from climate change. And as we've just seen in Egypt in COP27, the decisions made there, unfortunately, will not be sufficient to take us to a safe future there will be impacts of climate change. There are indeed already impacts of climate change on health. So we need to really accelerate the ambition for both adaptation and mitigation. And science academies worldwide are developing considerable expertise in bringing science and policy for climate change together, nationally, regionally, and of course, globally. So I will stop there, and it's a great pleasure for me to hand over to some of my colleagues to speak in more detail about these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hans. We'll now have the delving into the regional aspects from Professor Robin Fears. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I join with my colleagues in thanking the World Science Forum organisers for the invitation for this session. In fact, to some extent, the material that we've been producing in our reports have derived from previous discussions at a global level, for example, at the World Science Forum meeting in Budapest several years ago. So we are already grateful to the WSF for their support over a number of years as well. Now you've just heard from Andy Hames a wide-ranging account of the challenges to health from climate change and the opportunities for evidence-based mitigation and adaptation solutions. And as you've already heard from Christina, recently the Academies of Science around the world provided their recommendations on how to tackle urgently and with greater ambition the adverse effects of climate change and health. You've already seen from Christina, sorry, I'm going to time myself, that ESAC published a report 3 years ago now on climate change and health. This is published based on the evidence and perspectives from an expert group in Europe. Since then, we've used these outputs to engage with policymakers, particularly in the European institutions. But we've also tried to use the outputs to stimulate further discussion on key issues around the world. And it's to some extent those interregional aspects and the global conclusions that I will be covering in the next few minutes. And you will hear further detail from my colleague in Asia and Africa following my presentation. As Christina mentioned, and you've already seen a very similar version of this slide, all of the regional and global reports are now published. The global report came out in May of this year. And in addition, our work in Europe with ESAC in collaboration with academies elsewhere in the world has focused on some of the other critical issues for other regions. So not the 4 regions that in particular, Africa, Asia, the Americas and Europe, but those regions that are perhaps warming most rapidly in response to climate change, in particular the Arctic region and the wider Mediterranean region. And for the wider Mediterranean, I pay tribute to colleagues in the Cyprus Academy and the Cyprus Institute, who recently published their task force report on health in the Mediterranean region, and I will come back to that in a minute. My point from this slide is that we have attempted to embrace the very wide geographical representation in taking a transdisciplinary approach to collecting and assessing the evidence. These countries on the slide were formerly members of our regional working groups, and we feel we did get reasonable representation. But in addition, we've engaged with many others around the world during the course of our project. And as I mentioned, for example, several years ago at the World Science Forum in Budapest. So we've tried to show our emerging conclusions during the course of the project in order to seek feedback from the wider scientific community. You've seen a somewhat similar slide to this from Andy, emphasizing that there are multiple and diverse pathways of climate change risk. Broadly, these can be considered both as direct, for example, heat, and indirect, associated with ecological changes, ecosystem changes, for example, in agriculture, or socio-economic changes, for example, labour productivity and migration. These multiple pathways of risk conspire to provide major negative health impacts, both physical and mental, as Andy emphasised. The only additional point I will make from this slide is that, well, we are all susceptible to the impacts of climate change on health, but some are much more vulnerable than others, particularly populations who have actually contributed least to greenhouse gas emissions in the lower middle-income countries are suffering the greatest health effects. And within all countries, certain population groups are suffering disproportionately. For example, the elderly, mothers and children, migrants, other marginalised groups. And these inequalities, in effect, raise important issues for social justice, which of course is the theme of this week's World Science Forum. Andy showed a slide demonstrating that heat health impacts can now often be directly attributed to climate change. So we are at the stage of attributing the impacts, but there are wide variations in the evidence available. And as he mentioned, rather little comparable evidence for attribution in large parts of Africa and Asia. This disparity in the evidence base is for attribution is part of a larger problem summarized here in this slide, mapping all of the research literature on climate and health. And I guess even on the biggest screen, you can't see all the detail, but I do commend this recent publication mapping the different types of research output. But as I say, again, shows a relative disparity with rather little evidence in Africa and Latin America and parts of Asia. And this relates to the whole of the research literature on climate change and health impacts, solutions, and so on. All right, as you also heard from Andy, the indirect socio-economic effects of climate change may be amongst the most challenging for us to tackle, and indeed affect those who are already most vulnerable. This slide is taken from our discussions led by the Cyprus Institute for the Eastern Mediterranean Middle East region, and documents particularly large problems for this region in terms of forced migration and of course the adverse impacts of forced migration on human health. Countries within the region are amongst the worst affected, both in terms of contributing to forced migration and receiving migrants from elsewhere. Of course, I have to emphasize that only a proportion of this forced displacement can be attributed to climate change. But we do have examples in all of our regional reports and the global report of evidence where migration can be attributed or associated with climate change and in turn with negative health impacts. And this evidence, just one aspect of climate risk and health, supports, I think, an important general conclusion that the extent of specific climate health effects is very much dependent on the degree of social deprivation within the population. In consequence, specific adaptation solutions must be accompanied by action to address the social determinants of disadvantage in vulnerable populations. Again, an issue for social justice. The key messages from our IAP projects are listed in a very summarized way here. These messages may seem obvious, but until recently, health issues actually had rather little visibility in climate change discussions, and actually still do not get the attention that they merit, for example, in COP27 and COP26. But the scientific community, as it describes in this slide, has vital roles both in advising on the evidence that's already available and on the priorities for filling evidence gaps with new research. These include the geographical gaps that I mentioned just now, and also gaps in understanding of solutions in terms of their cost effectiveness, their trade-offs, the potential for inadvertent consequences, for example, maladaptation of unwisely focused solutions. And also the last bullet here, which came up, of course, rather late in our project, climate change is not the only global health crisis, and we lived through COVID-19 as we were doing this project, and that there are a number of lessons I think that we can draw from the intersection of COVID-19 and climate change. There's an interplay of risk factors. Each crisis does exacerbate the impact of the other, for example, via population displacement, food systems, air pollution. But it's also the case that we can apply lessons learned in responding to COVID-19, that is what worked or didn't work, to tackle climate change. And these rather general lessons include, of course, the imperative of global solidarity and social justice, the opportunities for science to inform public policy in real time, and the need to focus resources on vulnerable groups. But before finishing with some conclusions from our project, I'd like to just note that this is an exciting time in terms of the accumulation of scientific evidence on inequalities in climate change and their drivers. So within the last couple of months, we've seen major papers, for example, on the global inequalities of extreme heat on economic growth, gain a socio-economic impact that can be very difficult to tackle in many respects. We've seen quantification of the global carbon inequalities, that is the disproportionate contribution by developed countries and the richest cohorts in those countries in contributing to greenhouse gases. And the issues for climate change justice are becoming much more visible in international policy-making decisions, such as COP27, as our moderator mentioned. What does the IAP report say about climate justice? Well, that there are many health inequalities, and you know that. There are major issues with the funding of the response to climate change, particularly the necessary focus on health and the necessary focus on adaptation across sectors. Currently, health sector adaptation receives a tiny part of the total funding available for climate change. This was recently reviewed at COP27. In addition, there are perverse incentives for the use of fossil fuels or certain types of agricultural practice associated with greenhouse gas emissions. And it's important to rethink those subsidies that are creating perverse incentives to the detriment of health. We have indeed seen increased visibility of the issues for loss and damage reparation with an initial agreement at COP27. Although there is still a lot to be done on clarifying the mechanisms for loss and damage reparation, and indeed, I think, for using the scientific evidence to guide the potential application of loss and damage reparation according to where it can be used most usefully. And as Andy finished, the academies nationally, regionally and globally can have a continuing responsibility to articulate these points for social justice as well as for scientific evidence, and can provide a voice globally for those who often aren't heard in global discussions. So this is my final slide, to reaffirm the responsibilities of us in the scientific communities to stimulate policy and practice, to be more ambitious, to act with greater urgency by advising on what is already available in terms of the evidence base and on what the gaps might be in the generation and in the use of research outputs, to support particularly the health sector as champions of transformative change. Many speakers at the World Science Forum this week have talked about transformative change. Health professionals do, to some extent, have a privileged position of trust to be able to advise across the sectors in the climate policy debates. And finally, just to reiterate the point, the academies can act collectively in articulating the evidence and the perspectives on behalf of all those affected, so that indeed science can drive social justice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. I would now like to invite Shabana Khan to give us the perspective from Asia.
Thank you, Roseanne. Thank you, everyone. I'm really grateful to IAP and World Science Forum for giving opportunity for people to come from Asia and sponsoring the event. Thank you so much. I'm going to present the Asian perspective. So most of what we have been discussing from last few days about climate change is real, it's happening, it's intensifying, and health is going to be impacted for sure. And Asia is at the forefront of it in terms of what kind of impacts we are going to have. Why we should bother? Because more than half of the total population actually lives in Asia. We have some of the most dense and highly populated cities. We are heavily dependent on agriculture, which is susceptible to variations in monsoon, and that is very fragile to climate change impacts. We have the longest coastline, and we have very diverse biophysical, socioeconomic, and political systems, which are likely to produce both natural hazard as well as multiple social hazards. So theoretically, if we look into the impact of climate change, what will happen on the ground, it will look almost same for all the region, including Asia. And if you look into the health impacts, we can actually classify them into the similar categories, which might also happen in other regions. But if you go into further details, for example, if you are looking into the health impacts in case of extreme heat, then the situation starts to become very complex because there are not only direct and indirect impacts, but also the impact varies at the individual level, societal level, and even at governance level, which changes within a very short distance. And the response, the global response which we tend to apply, basically don't apply in every part of Asia. So we are all familiar with what happened in COVID-19. So this is on the right-hand side, there is a WHO map. From 2020 later half onwards, it is almost similar till now. And initially, it created a lot of fear in us. Okay, the entire world is having this pandemic. And now we have evolved that we are less affected by it. And most of the conversation and communication, if you look into the dashboard, it is about the total number of deaths happened, what number of confirmed cases, which are now decreasing, which is a good sign, and the number of vaccination, which is consistently increasing. So within scientific community, many people have also raised this issue before as well. So of course, some areas, like there is an inequity issue why some countries or some people couldn't have vaccination. And that is a good question to ask within scientific community, but we should also ask why we are just talking about vaccination and why so much vaccination after so many years. And we should not just only talk about implementing an invention, but also how to change that if some other solution is required at the local level. If we look into the death peaks in what happened in Southeast Asia, it pretty much matches with the peaks of India, because in India we have quite a huge population and we had a really bad impact of COVID-19. So let's look into it further. So if we look into what happened to the simple warning which is given to almost every country. So there was sudden lockdown, and because we have a huge population with a very diverse socioeconomic characteristics, many of the people lost job, they lost food security and everything. So government not only has to implement those strict measures, but they also had to support a lot of population, and which is not going to be easy. And the impact are even very visible now. A lot of people were pushed further into below poverty line. So on the very severe note, we had a lot of suicides, not just among the mature people, but also among the young students, elderly, retired people, daily wage laborers, not directly because of the COVID, but because of those extreme measures that these people lost hope somehow. And it was really sad to see that. And this is the picture just next day after the lockdown from Delhi. On left-hand side, like millions of people, because transport got closed and it was complete lockdown. They had to walk for thousands of kilometers to go back to their rural homeland where they could have sustained without rent and all of that. But during the process, so many people also lost their lives. So, and that was, again, because of the way the risk got communicated on. And on the right-hand side, there is a graph of what happened in Maldives. It presents an extreme side on the extreme side, where it's a very small island in the Arabian Sea. And of course, it also implemented the lockdown, but because its economy couldn't sustain it, within a few months, it made the most open border policy. And if we look into the real impact of COVID, which actually happened in 2021, so if we actually plan it better, we had almost a year. If we do not really press everyone, like particularly those who cannot apply those solutions to apply. So migration did not only happen internally, but they also happened across the borders. So millions of people had to bring back to India after COVID-19. And if we look into the migration pattern in Asia, Asia is basically, because we have a huge population, we are more of population giving region. And if you look at where all these population are moving from, so of course, these are all South Asian countries, China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Indonesia. And of course, Maldives and many islands as well, which are highly prone to various hazards. And if we really think about climate change, many of the islands may also submerge. So how we want to plan for these kind of migration, which happens post-disaster, like because they have lost job, and in many cases, they may not have the home to come back to, I think. So in that case, there is a need for the policies to plan this international migration in a better way. So in terms of risk communication, almost all the countries received the similar kind of warning, but the response at the country level varied significantly. So countries like India, like where we have a lot of social media communication, and we are more of Bogle culture, so we had infodemic. Then there was countries where there was very little information available. Even after COVID, we find it very difficult to get some data to find out how the population responded to it. And few countries actually did well when they could engage communities because they had resources or it was feasible to do so. But it's difficult in the context of Asia when we are talking about billions of people. And much of it is happening because many of our global policies, including SFDRR and SDGs, and including UNFCCC, there is a very little emphasis on the risk communication. We definitely talk about warning and monitoring, but that is one aspect of risk communication, and there is a lot that local people at the ground level deal with. Like as a scientific community, I say our focus is still narrow. We still deal with very focused set of data and focused about what we are doing. But the people are receiving information from news, from science, from media, and all these warnings as well. So they have to deal with a lot. And because it's a very diverse group, the kind of response we find among different sectors tend to differ widely. So in many cases, people give an excuse that COVID was, again, unprecedented, never happened before. But if we look into the hazard pattern, which is historical, we always had flooding in every part of the world almost. And we have data for hundreds of years. We have maps at globally, nationally, even at district level. So even if we see in the areas which have always experienced flooding, whenever the major disaster happen, we find the cases where people are reporting there is no warning and poor action. It's not that there was no warning, because I studied that area, Uttarakhand, but the warning was so much at the last stage, and it was a siren kind of warning where people had to fight or flight. There was not third option. So we know that many people also get paralyzed in such cases. Some people like what to do. They totally lose hope. And that warning is actually not sufficient. So, and then the warning again varies for different kind of hazard. This is another scenario from in the water scarcity situation. Like this is one area, a subdivision of Delhi, Dwarka, where you can see within a very small area, there are 5 different kind of response patterns to the water scarcity because of change in both biophysical nature of water availability, groundwater availability, plus how people respond to it, because the socioeconomic condition within a small area tend to differ so much. And if we talk about the number of stakeholders, in India there are hundreds of them who are engaged, and the decisions are affected by so many factors. And so is the risk communication, that in that case, even the person who knows what to do, they are also likely to do what is more comfortable. So here there's an example from an engineer who knows that we should not dig a borehole in the floodplain, but he does that because that is easier to do so rather than communicating across the entire system. So there is another example I wanted to bring, like those people who are familiar with Delhi, we really used to have a lot of traffic jams. So in 2018, there was a great invention happened, that is they introduced median U-turn, and it's very effective for, it has almost like kind of reduced the time that we used to spend on the red lights, right? But not everyone was informed because it was not introduced in all part of the city. So I remember in 2018 when initially it happened, I myself was driving and I crashed into this U-turn because I was also not informed. In Delhi, India, right-hand side driving is the fast lane driving, and I was not driving faster because I'm not a fast driver either. But what happened, then the police person is asking me and try to fit me, because somewhere the government official also has this responsibility to fit, us into certain category. So try to fit me into speed driving, which was not the case, but it was my lucky day, so I was safe also, and I got the help. So someone actually helped me to address the whole thing. And that person informed me, you are not the first one. Actually, within last 2 weeks, so many accidents have happened on the same spot. So it takes time. So the implementation of any invention is not just about invention. And this data, the graph you can see, this is the graph of 2021. After 3 years, that spot still is highlighted as an accident prone, means a lot of accidents have happened. So even after 3 years of implementation of an invention, such kind of the negative impacts of that invention continues. So here I just wanted to present the word of invention and implementation. It is not simply about an invention, but then there are a lot more factors which are involved. And I think it's our responsibility as a scientific community to not just focus on the invention, but all the other barriers to address them, because if we are not addressing it, we are creating more of hazard also, which might occur. So I hope I could contribute something. So thank you so much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thanks, Shabana, very much for highlighting the risk aspects. We'll now go to the presentation from Africa. And this was due to be given by Corrady Wright, but unfortunately at the very last minute she was unable to travel and didn't have time to record her presentation. And so I am going to try to do the very best I can to run through her slides. It's a very short presentation, and I think if Robin has anything that he would like to add at the end, he's welcome to do so, and I ask if the questions could please be directed to him. Do you have the presentation? Thank you. Right. So this is highlighting the input that comes from the Network of African Science Academies to the regional project, looking at climate change and health impacts. And the reference to the report is given there at the bottom. So if anyone would like to download it, it is freely available on the IAP and ESAC websites. So this is a very busy slide, which I'm quite certain you're unable to read, and I'm also unable to read from here. But what I can say is that what we can focus on is the first columns, where you see two red columns going down. It's highlighting the change in temperature, and you can see that it's red, which means that there's going to be a positive change in temperature, and you can see that in the middle of each of the red blocks there's a dark black spot, which is saying that we're very confident of these results, that the evidence shows that this is very, very likely to happen. Also at the map at the top left, you can see that Africa has been divided into a number of regions which are perhaps not the traditional divisions, but done because this is where the climate impacts are going to be felt in some similar way. So for example, Southern Africa, you can see that we've got East Southern Africa and West Southern Africa because the impacts are different. And then if we're looking at rainfall, I think is the blue columns, and blue indicates that there's going to be a decrease in the rainfall over Africa, also with quite a high degree of certainty. And the other ones relate to snow. There's a decrease in the amount of snow-capped, and you can see we already have evidence of that from Kilimanjaro, where the snow cap has melted, as well as in North Africa. Sorry, I can't do more justice to that. It's a slide that is taken from the IPCC Working Group 2 report. All right, so what were the main findings of this NASAC report? That number one, Africa is extremely vulnerable to adverse health effects of climate change, not unexpected. Firstly, because of its physical factors. A large part of Africa consists of dry lands. About 33% of Africa consists of desert. We also have many climate hazards, tropical cyclones, floods, fires that are climate-induced. We have a very high burden of pre-existing diseases, both infectious and non-infectious. Number four, non-resilient healthcare systems. So the public healthcare systems are not as well developed as they are in many other parts of the world. And so if you add on that some additional effects due to climate, it places a lot of pressure on the health sector. And then of course we've got the whole underbelly of extreme poverty across much of the continent. Second point is that the evidence for climate change already exists from much of the research that's been undertaken, and further climate change is inevitable in the coming decade. Africa as a continent faces many challenges. It's got a very young population, it's rapidly growing and developing, and so we need to take that into account. A very important factor, is number 4, is that the data on climate change and health impacts in Africa are dispersed and scarce. I think you've already seen from some of the other presentations that Africa, very often, there's huge gaps over the continent in terms of data availability. And then finally, health adaptation and mitigation are not adequately planned in Africa. The recommendations that stemmed from the report: firstly, there's a need for a climate policy, and this policy must reflect emerging issues on climate change and health. Health needs to be considered in nationally determined contributions. We require situation analysis and needs assessments in our national climate change and health adaptation plans, which are missing from many of the countries. I think there are very few that actually have these kinds of plans. It's important that we have intersectoral collaboration between departments and ministries. Often these ministries work in silos. They need to collaborate. Thirdly, we have already mentioned the data needs to be collected. Surveillance systems need to be installed so that we can get much better data on what's going on in Africa. There's a huge need for strengthening our climate change knowledge and, of course, capacity development amongst scientists and decision makers. To some extent, this has been addressed by the higher education sector and by NGOs, but there's still a great need. And then adaptation, mitigation, advocacy, and partnership are critical elements. So what are the issues for equity and climate justice? Africa is a continent with a strong economic growth trajectory. There are challenges in health protection from climate change that include bridging these inequity gaps that are so pervasive over the continent. We've heard about poverty, inequality, and unemployment. It's been reiterated over and over again. We all know about the vulnerable groups, and we'd like to highlight here particularly women, children, those who are living in poverty, people with existing diseases, HIV/AIDS in particular, people with disabilities, people who are living in rural areas who have very poor access to health systems. The point is made here that climate action plans could help to address the inequity and injustices, and of course inclusive governance, inclusivity that across the health sectors and inclusivity of government and non-government sectors is absolutely critical. Corrady, I'm sure you're listening in. I'm sure I haven't done justice to what you would have done, this short slide presentation, not being able to elaborate too much. But I would like to ask Robin if you've got anything to add, just a brief point before we go into the questions and discussion. Thank you.
Let me just add, I don't know, am I mic'd up? Okay, so let me just add to that very clear summary of what Corrady would have said. That, of course, there is a great deal of detail in the NASAC report at the country level and for the different regions, as you mentioned, within the African continent. You don't need me to tell you that Africa is very diverse, but there are challenges overall for, I think, the whole of the continent. I just want to single out one point with regard to one of the bullet items that need to do much more to plan adaptation and mitigation solutions in Africa. And to do that, there is a need for more and better evidence, the scientific evidence to guide solutions, adaptation, mitigation, general building of health sector resilience, and now post COP27 to guide loss and damage reparations. We do need the scientific evidence, for example, on health effects of climate change to guide all of the solutions. The other point I just want to single out is intersectoral collaboration, which was mentioned on one of Caridy's final recommendations. This is crucial. The issues are not just a matter for the health sector, but action in other sectors, for example, agriculture, urban planning, transportation, have big impacts on health. That requires essentially a reiteration of the mantra of health in all policies. Must consider the issues for health in planning in other sectors. That, of course, requires a joined up approach across government and across the continent. So I'll stop there.
Right, thanks very much, Robin. Let's go to the Q&A now. I know that we are running a little bit over time. We started late, but I would like to give an opportunity to the audience to ask some questions. So if you, I think there are mics in the aisles. If you just go up to the mics, and then I can try to see you. See a question here. Do you have a mic, or are you going to go to the one at the side? Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ioan Jelev. I am Vice President of the Academy of Agricultural and Forestry Sciences from Romania. And my question, it's in relation, how realistic is this target of zero green gas emissions in 2050 if we take in account the actual evolution starting with 1990s, where the first convention concerning climate changes was adopted, and the evolution starting with 1990 of this emission, and practically what does mean this zero emission target if we take in account that green gases in general are also from natural causes in nature. Maybe some comments about this zero target in what in realistic terms means this zero target of emissions.
All right, thank you very much. Is there another question while we think about how we can answer?
This part of the room, yes.
Yes.
Hi,
please,
good morning.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for that sharing. But I think the science is crystal clear. I think there's enough of science. And I think in most forums, I think we need to see the merger of the other elements. For example, Paris Agreement is always quoted for the targets, but the means of implementation is never quoted. I think today is evident we know what's causing the problem. We know the solutions are crystal clear, but for continents and countries in the south, I think the issue is the means to do it. And that doesn't get the kind of traction. That's why I think in the COP meetings or the Conference of Parties, despite even the COP having its own science body, the IPCC, during negotiations, I think science takes a backstage, and it's economics and politics. So I think what needs to come into this kind of discussions as well is the means of implementation, technology transfer, new and additional funding. If not, we can come up with all kinds of science-based solutions, but if there's no means of implementation, it'll be status quo. So this is just a comment and maybe some reaction. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Both questions a little bit off our topic of health, but are there any panelists who want to try to address them? If not, I can perhaps say something about to my knowledge, about the zero carbon emissions. I won't answer about how feasible it is. It's obviously going to be an extremely difficult task for the majority of nations, but I think the way in which it's going to be done is through offsets. So from my understanding, you continue to emit carbon, but you create carbon offsets through, for example, planting trees, and in that way you can move towards zero carbon emissions, is my limited understanding. But if anyone else wants to comment, by all means do. And anyone from, Robin, you want to make a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I can't disagree with that point, of course. I mean, I just want to emphasize that from the health perspective, as Andy emphasised, right at the beginning, there's the important dimension of the health co-benefits of mitigation, and there's some good examples in our report. Well, I hope there's some good examples in our reports. For example, how action in agriculture to reduce the contribution of agriculture to its greenhouse gas emissions can also bring health co-benefits in terms of the dietary recommendations. Equally, mitigation of in cities, and this was an example from Andy, can bring reduction of pollution, again with health co-benefits. And of course, we didn't have time to review in detail, but the healthcare sector itself in a number of countries has ambitions for zero carbon. We do in England, and this is ambitious, and of course it does require examining not just it within the health sector, but the supply chain. So there's a lot of implications for goals for zero carbon emissions in a number of sectors.
Thanks. Not sure we've answered all your questions, but you're welcome to meet with us afterwards. Any further questions? Please go ahead.
Francis Zaparovich from Australia. I just want to ask about the possibility of removing CO2 from the atmosphere, because there is research going on in that area.
Possibility of removing CO2
Yeah.
from the atmosphere. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Well, it wasn't a key topic in the project that we've been describing. But of course, academies in various other work around the world have considered issues for carbon capture and storage and the technologies needed to do that, and whether it's likely that the technologies that we can envisage at the moment will make a significant contribution to removing CO2 from the atmosphere. For example, in ESAC, and Christina might want to say more, we have published on the issues for considering, for example, bioenergy derived emissions, carbon capture and storage. I mean, I wouldn't like to generalize from what isn't my work, but I think there are still challenges in the technology in order to make a significant contribution, and that really the focus must be on reducing the emission of greenhouse gas in the near future.
Okay, thank you, Andy. We're putting a lot of pressure on you there. Any other questions?
My name is Christy. I'm from Oldham Techware Wastewater Treatment Company. I just want to find out, so there's a lot of data being captured about, or making predictions about which countries are going to be most affected. But one of the biggest challenges that policymakers face is that governments have a very limited time to make policy changes. So the data that you're finding is all predicting 20, 30, 40 years from now. How can we use that data and prepare for the possibilities of that happening in real time now, and start making real changes now to prepare for when we have migrations, when we have increased disease, when we have lack of water and countries facing malnutrition?
Okay, thanks for that question. I think there's a general sort of how do we get the scientific evidence to policymakers so that they can act in time. Christina, do you want to just make a general comment about science to policy?
Yeah, you mean about in general? Yes, I think this is very important. And I mean, when it comes to this report, or these reports about the effect of climate change, I think it's very important to, to inform the policymakers about what is happening. And I would like to remind you that our reports are free to download. And I think that this is a very important duty of the scientists also to inform the policymakers. And the conclusion from these reports here is that the situation is very different in different parts of the world. So there is a very severe climate injustice, not only how the population is affected by the climate changes when it comes to health issues, but also what is done in terms of mitigation and adaptation. And I think that this is very important to point out, and this is actually how we work under the umbrella of IEP with many reports also, that we look at the situation in different parts of the world, so the different local networks do this, and with experts then nominated by the science academies in the different parts of the world, and then also summarize or make up a global report of this. We have done this before when it comes to report on food and nutrition security, for example, where there are reports from the different region networks, and which is then also summarized in global reports. And I think that this can help to improve the social justice also, that you can compare the different parts of the world. It's now going on also another report dealing with the decarbonization of transport, which is also important when it comes to the greenhouse gas emissions. And then, when it comes to the health issues then, because this is also a situation where we have to reduce. There is work now going on in Africa with a report from Africa, and there will be in other parts of the world. And this is the way that we will continue to work within ESAC also. Let me also point out that many of these reports are quite complicated. It's complicated to make recommendations. And I want to point out that in many working groups, we have included social sciences also, because this has been mentioned by many speakers here during the World Science Forum, that social sciences are very important to solve the problems and to provide recommendations. And we have realized this within ESAC also.
I'd just like to give a final opportunity to Shabana to say something if you want to. If not, it's fine.
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Oh.
So, just to the last question which is posed, I think, as what Christina also mentioned, both scientists and social scientists need to work together, and I think we need to facilitate it more, because even if when we really want to read those policy papers, they are very limited, and there should be, like, even when you search the journal article, often you see that one kind of views have been recurrently published, the other side should also be published. So when, like, as a scientific community, if we make the process easy and facilitate all kind of possibilities through publication, either through reports or through journals, I think it would be easier for the governments also to plan for it.
Thanks. I'm mindful of time. I'm eating into your lunch break, so I would just like now to move to the closing and to ask Robin to just make some closing remarks from what he's heard, and then I'll go finally over to Christina to close out the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rosanna. I will try and be brief, because I realise you probably all want to go and have lunch. Well, I'm not going to spend long summarising the last hour and a half, because we've covered a lot of issues, scientific and across the sectors. I hope we can all agree that there is growing evidence that climate change is a health emergency, that there are many pathways of risk, and multiple adverse health effects, as described by Shabana and our African colleagues, both physical and mental. Yesterday, the President emphasized the role of science to address and challenge injustice, and I think this was a theme throughout our session, that the speakers demonstrated the importance of thinking about solutions through the lens of climate justice, as our moderator introduced the session, based, of course, on robust scientific evidence and monitored for effectiveness, and there is a lot to do, but I think we can agree there is a general point that we do need more science to characterize and prioritize the potential solutions, whether that's for mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, and there are new needs for us to come together as a scientific community to use and understand the scientific advances to inform and improve policy, risk communication, innovation, and practice. And just to finish with a couple of points I've noted from our discussion, social justice must provide the framework for all that we've been talking about in terms of the range of health impacts, the complexity of health issues, the interaction with other health crises, and Shabana described in particular COVID-19, and the greatest effects on vulnerable populations associated with inequitable access to health services, complexity of risk communications, and the contingent policy gaps that need to be identified and addressed. And that does indeed require engaging with the community and using local experience in filling those knowledge and policy gaps. Elsewhere, we talked about the multiple impacts, for example, in Africa, which do challenge growth and development. And this is a key issue, of course, in thinking about the SDGs. Just finally, with some of the discussion points that were raised just now, that it is a complex situation. Obviously, we must think about health in the context of the other priorities for tackling climate change, the objectives for zero carbon emissions, challenging for many societies and many sectors, and above all, how do we bring and interpret the scientific evidence to the attention of policymakers and drive joined-up policy across the sectors. I will finish there.
Thanks very much. Christina, do you want to have the final word and close our session, please?
Yeah, I would like to say that we know a lot. I mean, we know what is the cause of the climate change, and we know that it affects, for example, the health, but it also affects the biodiversity, and it has many other effects also. So we need to do something also, and for that we need to be better to influence policymakers again, which I just said. We just continue as we have done, and we see that the emissions of greenhouse gases, which is the cause of all this, more or less, that just increases all the time. There was a hope of the COVID-19 that in the recovery that we would learn and how to behave in a better way. We did not, so that increases again. And what is needed now is not just to go on like we do, but transformative changes are needed. Otherwise, I mean, we need to fulfill the Sustainable Development Goals in order to have a climate justice and a social justice for everybody in our world. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you to you, the audience, for being with us. Enjoy your lunch. I'd like to say a very big thank you to my 3 panelists who are with me here, and to the 2 panelists who have joined us online. Sorry that you could not be with us, but thank you, everybody.
Yeah.